ever wondered, why hasn't there been a live-action Metroid movie? Samus is one of the most recognizable and popular characters in gaming history, and yet no one has brought her story to the big screen, even with Oscar-winning actresses publicly announcing their interest. Well, it nearly happened, and John Woo nearly directed it. With the creation of Samus Aran, Nintendo had a rare thing in their possession, a playable lead female character whose lasting popularity is as unanimous as Lara Croft, Chun-Li, and Jill Valentine. Samus is Metroid, arguably the #1 speedrunning game with a consistent and likable lead character across every iteration of the franchise. With movie adaptations of video game IP beginning to creep back into the public consciousness, Nintendo was sitting on a goldmine, one which, as it turned out, they coveted. Following the feature-length Nintendo movie, The Wizard in 1989,
I love the Power Glove. It's so bad.
And a disappointing live-action adaptation of Super Mario Bros. In 1993, Nintendo became a little itchy about adapting their properties for the big screen. The reactions to both movies had not been great. The disaster of Super Mario Bros., which I made a video about here, was written about in major publications. It was a black eye for Nintendo. And really, what did it get them? The Wizard made $20 million at the box office. Super Mario Bros. 3 made $500 million in sales, and it would have done that with or without the Wizard. Nintendo didn't need Hollywood. Hollywood needed Nintendo. And so they kept knocking on the door of Nintendo asking to make movies off their successful franchises, and continue to knock to this day. For the last 20 years, Hollywood has been in almost constant discussion with Nintendo about adapting Metroid. And it's not just directors and writers, but actors and critics as well. In 2019, Metroid EX manga author Itsuki Koji expressed interest. In 2018, former UFC fighter and current WWE wrestler Ronda Rousey threw her hat into the ring. I've always wanted to be Samus, that would be badass. That same year, Jordan Vogt Roberts also expressed his plans. My Metroid movie legitimately would be Samus alone. It would be a little bit of her talking to herself. You put her alone, and it's almost got more to do with the silence of a movie like Drive, like the quietness and having it be like a real intense mood piece, but mixed with sci-fi. And in 2020, Oscar-winning actor Brie Larson told Animal Talking,
"Definitely want to make that movie. Definitely want to participate in that." So Nintendo, once again, I would love to do it.
She even did a sponsored Instagram post to promote Metroid Dread in 2021, where again, she expressed just how much she loves Samus Aran. And yet, despite all of that interest, there is no Metroid movie. But one group did come close to convincing Nintendo to let their grip loosen. During the mid-2000s, legendary director John Woo was set to direct a series of live-action Metroid movies, with one of the writers of Buffy the Vampire Slayer penning the script. Budgets were being decided, distributors were being approached, casting choices were being made. Welcome to Cutscene. This is the frustrating history of John Woo's Metroid. Released in 1986 for the NES, Metroid is one of the most fondly remembered titles for the system and those early days of Nintendo's dominance on the home market, putting players in the shoes of bounty hunter Samus Aran as she took out a group of space pirates led by the cybernetic organism Mother Brain, who was exploiting organisms known as Metroids for galactic domination. It got a Game Boy sequel in 1991, but reached new heights of popularity with 1994's Super Metroid for the Super Nintendo Entertainment System. Its mix of action, adventure, and exploration is still admired to this day, with the game being held as one of the greatest video games ever made. It's a staple of the speedrunning community, and it's regularly memed at GDQ with the call to either save the animals or save the frames. It was shortly after the first game's release that we nearly got our first adaptation of Metroid. Though Mother Brain was one of the main antagonists in Captain N the Games Master, Samus never stepped out from her shadow. But in 1989, DiC announced that they would be adding to their Super Mario Bros. 3 cartoon, rebranding it to the Super Mario Power Hour to compete against Disney's upcoming 2-hour block. The Super Mario Power Hour, as the name suggests, would have been an entire hour-long lineup of Nintendo cartoons, including a spin-off for King Koopa and new shows based on California games, Castlevania, Double Dragon, and Metroid? The artwork for this series wrongly depicts Samus as a man. You don't actually learn that Samus is a woman in the first game until the end of it, and it's likely that no one at DiC had even started playing the game, let alone finished it, so this gender assumption was totally overlooked. And in fairness to them, the official manual for Metroid even confuses Samus's sex, but it's really not great. Sadly for DiC, stations were not interested in an entire hour of Nintendo products, and instead they went with the Super Mario Bros. Super Show, which had a Super Mario Bros. Cartoon along with the animated adventures of The Legend of Zelda.
Excuse me, princess.
Following the release of Super Metroid in 1994, the series went into a state of hibernation. Even though her contemporaries got 3D upgrades for the N64, Samus's only real appearance on the console was as a playable character in Super Smash Bros. Metroid lay dormant until 2002 with the release of Metroid Prime for Nintendo's GameCube, along with Metroid Fusion on the Game Boy Advance. Metroid Prime was a huge hit for Nintendo and was the second best-selling game of 2002, becoming the 6th best-selling game on the console overall with 2.8 million copies sold. Metroid Prime even spawned a couple of sequels and spin-off games for the Nintendo DS. After nearly a decade of sleep, Samus was back in a big way. It wasn't just in the game sphere. Just 2 months after the release of Metroid Prime, Variety reported that Nintendo had signed a deal with producers Warren Zide and Craig Perry of Final Destination and American Pie fame to make a feature-length movie based on the Metroid franchise. Little is known of the Zide-Perry Metroid movie outside of a supposed plot that was in the Variety article. The story is set in a once peaceful galaxy, which has its prosperity shattered by a startling discovery. On a routine mapping expedition on a planet, a survey crew discovers a new airborne life form, the Metroid. Able to engulf other living beings, feed upon their energy, and multiply in great numbers, they prove a terrifying menace. Female bounty hunter Samus Aran is commissioned by the Galactic Federation to eliminate the pests, but she soon discovers that pirates with a stolen Metroid specimen are plotting to breed and build an unstoppable army. Whatever the case, Zide and Perry only had a 6-month option on Metroid, and they let that expire in mid-2003. But unlike the gap between Super Metroid and Metroid Prime, Samus wouldn't have to wait long for an update on her big screen debut, as The Hollywood Reporter revealed in April 2004 that John Woo's Tiger Hill had stepped in. They had optioned not just one movie, but a trilogy, with the first set to be released in 2006. In the report, producer Brad Foxhoven says everyone involved is looking at this as a big budget picture. We see a tremendous opportunity to launch a film franchise with Nintendo as a partner. Woo himself said, "We are very fortunate that there is such an extensive amount of material to draw upon for the film, due to there being so many iterations of the game over the years." And this was just one of Tiger Hill's big planned productions in the coming years. Founded in May of 2003, Tiger Hill Entertainment was the brainchild of Brad Foxhoven, who teamed with John Woo, Terrence Chang, and Sega to launch a production company that didn't just make movies, but also make games that could become movies. Foxhoven had been working for comic book publisher Top Cow Productions, who had printed comics for brands like Tomb Raider, as well as their own IPs like Witchblade, and he'd worked with various people to get those adapted into TV shows or movies. He was friends with the person who convinced Eidos to make Tomb Raider into a movie, and he himself personally had got Witchblade adapted into a TV show. Foxhoven was meeting with people in Hollywood about adapting other Top Cow comics and convinced Woo to start a production company together, primarily to make a video game that would serve as a sequel to Woo's 1992 movie Hard Boiled. Problem was that neither of them held the rights to Hard Boiled, so instead they were restricted to making a pseudo-sequel. They called it Stranglehold. We couldn't say it was a sequel, but we brought back Chow Yun-Fat and the thematic world around it, so anyone who understood the franchise around the world knew this was a sequel to Hard Boiled without actually calling it as such. Years later, Tiger Hill struck deals to make a movie based on Warren Spector's Ninja Gold, a video game with John Carpenter called Psychopath, and also developed a game similar to Ninja Gaiden titled Shadow Clan. In doing that, we continued to meet a lot of people in the world that wanted to bridge the gap between film and games. Tiger Hill were doing just that, and it was putting them in the same rooms as both parties, as well as the right people. And it came at a good time for them, as both Resident Evil and Lara Croft Tomb Raider had been moderate box office successes, and conversations about video game movie adaptations were starting to gather pace. And because Foxhoven was working with John Woo, he managed to get a meeting with Nintendo. Make no mistake, John carried a lot of the credibility that got me through that door. If it had just been me by myself, I probably would not have gotten as far as I did. John has a lot of cachet in the Asia-Pacific territories, and obviously, the Japanese also certainly respect what he has done over the years, so his notoriety carried a lot of weight in those early discussions. Although Nintendo originally went with Zyde Perry in 2003, Tiger Hill had been in discussions about adapting properties with Nintendo for a little while, and Foxhoven had a strategic plan about his pitches. Obviously, everyone wants Zelda. Anyone who calls Nintendo asks for Zelda. But I knew right away that my name wasn't Steven Spielberg, so the chances of me getting Zelda were slim. So with Zelda off the table, Foxhoven looked at what was, prior to the release of Metroid Prime, a dormant series that he'd likely be able to get. It just so happened that Metroid was one of his favorite games, and his passion for it endeared Nintendo to him. This was going to be a collaborative process, and they respected that, and they respected the fact we weren't rushing to some crazy deadline. We didn't have all of these crazy attachments to the project, we didn't have a star or a writer that we were forcing onto the project. We went at it saying we wanted to get to know the world and the franchise, and that helped us get as far as we did. Collaboration might have been the plan, but it wasn't what really happens. If I was to ask you in 2003, what is Metroid about, you'd probably be able to tell me. 1986's Metroid has a plot, as does Metroid 2 Return of Samus. Super Metroid has even more of an involved plot than either of those two games. All of this is detailed in the game's manuals, as well as magazines like Nintendo Power. But if I was to ask you in 2003, who is Samus Aran and what is she like as a person, you might not have a lot to go on. And this was the problem Tiger Hill found themselves in. Back when Metroid was created, it was all about the gameplay and the gameplay mechanics. So aside from the plot, it's also no secret that it's heavily inspired by other film franchises or popular franchises that already existed before it. So when we went in, we realized we had a challenge of making a film based on a game that was heavily inspired by another possibly well-known film. In the press release in 2004, Foxhoven talked about how they were going into the development of Metroid knowing that a mainstream audience would not be that familiar with the video game franchise. While Metroid was a big seller and Metroid Prime had breathed new life into the series, it was not as mainstream as Mario, Pokemon, or even Zelda. At least Zelda had a cartoon in the early 90s. Even hugely known characters like Spider-Man or Batman got origin stories on the big screen because it's safer to assume that the audience knows nothing about the world. And those that do will get a kick out of seeing things that they recognize being brought to life. Ergo, Woo's Metroid movie would be centered around Samus's battles with the Metroids and Mother Brain. But its core would be an origin story for the character of Samus Aran. Tiger Hill brought in David Greenwald to write up the pitch and script for the first installment of a series of Metroid movies, mostly off the success of his writing on Buffy the Vampire Slayer. Foxhoven believed that while other names created the characters, Greenwald had given them actual character. He was a guy who understood how to make a female character a hero and also relatable, because as we all know, that's an impossible task. Greenwald was not the first writer they met, but he was the one that got the gig. So the core production team all traveled to Kyoto to meet with Nintendo to ask them some questions about their heroine Samus. And to their surprise, Nintendo had no answers. In fact, according to Foxhoven, Nintendo was surprised to be even asked these sorts of questions. They themselves had never thought about them. And these weren't big or difficult questions. They were things like, who is Samus? What are her goals? What are her fears? Foxhoven recalls it was all base-level stuff that Greenwald needed in order to flesh out the character across a feature-length movie. But the more Greenwald asked, the less Nintendo had answers, and he asked questions for the next 3 years. By this point, the Metroid Prime trilogy had been completed, with the third game released on the Wii in 2007. Not to mention, the planned release date for the first Metroid movie was well in the past too. At the end of those 3 years, Greenwald didn't even have a full treatment, let alone a first draft of a script. Nintendo appreciated the questions but had never thought about them before, and ultimately didn't have a lot of answers. In the end, they felt uncomfortable with our team being the ones to propose those answers. And it also might have been the success of Metroid Prime that halted development of the movie. In a way, Tiger Hill were lucky that Metroid Prime was a hit. More was being written about the Metroid canon than ever before, but its success also made Nintendo more protective of the franchise. Nintendo had asked what fans wanted next and given it to them. But imagine if Metroid Prime had failed, Nintendo would have rethought everything they were doing with the series, including a movie adaptation. As Foxhoven puts it, in some ways, it was a lose-lose scenario. After spending years getting nowhere, Tiger Hill let their film rights to the Metroid franchise lapse so they could focus their energy on Stranglehold. Foxhoven knew the sort of person he wanted to cast as their heroine, but despite interest from a number of studios to release the movie, he could not get the film financed without a script. There were rumors that John Woo was going to announce something at the 2008 San Diego Comic-Con, and a grainy image claiming to be the movie poster was released online, but the project was dead. This seeming refusal from Nintendo to help out with the development of the Metroid movie can almost be felt in a quote from one of Metroid's key developers, Yoshio Sakamoto, who told Coming Soon in 2004, "There have been some misleading reports before the E3 the Metroid production was confirmed, but to be accurate, it's that the company that John Woo works for has gained the rights to negotiate with Nintendo of America to make Metroid into a movie. Metroid's production hasn't been officially decided yet, and there's no release plans for it." But I know what some of you might be thinking. Didn't Nintendo explore Samus's origins in Metroid Other M? And the answer to that would be yes. Yes, they did. And that game might only exist because the movie conversations had taken place. I can't presume to take credit for that, but I would have to make that leap that it somehow had an influential factor on that movement. There's no way they didn't come out of a 3-year process with all of those questions and all of that exploration and all of that time we spent going in to sit there and say that we didn't play a role. There are elements in there that I look at and smile and think, well, that came from one of our discussions. And that's great. If that helped push it forward, that a writer like David or a producer like myself, that when you go into these meetings, you want to put in a part of yourself and the overall family of where the property and franchise is going. And wouldn't you Adam and Eve it, Metroid Other M was written and directed by Yoshio Sakamoto, the man so adamant that John Woo's Metroid movie was not officially happening. He told Games TM following the release of Metroid Other M that he believed this is how the story of Samus should be told. If you ask me if I want Samus's story to be told in cinemas, I really don't think so. There were a lot of things working against Tiger Hill, be it Nintendo's lack of answers, the success of Metroid Prime, or Yoshio Sakamoto being dismissive. But really, an Italian plumber's failed journey to the big screen a decade prior was perhaps the biggest hurdle to jump. The games industry is already successful financially and on a popularity index, so when they look at someone taking a popular franchise that already has possibly several million fans very well versed in the world, they're already financially stable, so they don't need a movie they can retire upon. And if anything, it can hurt their business. So the concern from the game industry has always been, if you take my property into a film or TV series, you could hurt it to a level where no one wants to buy my game. In practice, the release of Super Mario Bros. In 1993 did not hurt the brand as some might have feared. Super Mario World was still a big hit for the Super Nintendo, as was Super Mario Kart. A few years later, Super Mario 64 was heralded as one of the greatest games ever released, but it also tightened Nintendo's grip on those characters even more, and by extension, they held their other characters back too. And it wasn't just Nintendo. Sakamoto has expressed that the reason Metroid never got a game on the N64 was because he could not imagine how Samus would move around on screen with that N64 controller. Foxhoven argues this reluctance limited the collaboration between the parties on Metroid, which was the ultimate failing of the movie. Super Mario Bros. Might have meant that Nintendo didn't have a good history with Hollywood, but 3 decades later, that could be about to change. The release of 2023's The Super Mario Bros. Movie has shown that Nintendo are willing to open the doors and let the ghosts of a 30-year-old movie be sucked up into a vacuum and have their most popular character break out of the video game realm. And such is that willingness that even Yoshio Sakamoto, the man so set against John Woo's Metroid, has somewhat changed his tune. When asked about the new Mario Bros. Movie and whether or not we could see Metroid get the same treatment, he told CNET, "Personally, I hope that it does become a reality someday." What, after all of that? After all that, we just... Make up your mind, mate!